Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming this evening. It's good to see you all. I do this about once a quarter, hire a hall, publicise it as best I can to everybody to invite. I mean, technically there could be 77,000 people here today, which would be slightly difficult in this room, obviously. We have a fluctuating attendance. Sometimes we've been north of 100, sometimes south of 20. It's quite interesting. We try to interact as much as possible, my office, myself, with the constituency, and we do it in various ways. And I like to do this because it gives people the opportunity to come along, ask questions about what's mattering to them, matters to them at the time. I have no idea what's coming up in terms of questions. That's just the way it is. And I sort of like it like that, to be honest with you, because I want to give straightforward, candid answers where possible. Personal opinion, government position. I will say when one is one and one is the other, because I'm not always in step with where the government is on some issues. And I hope that you appreciate that. I hope you appreciate the fact that I try to be as straightforward and as honest as one can be in politics, because you don't always have the opportunity to have a yes/no answer to everything. So without further ado, first question.
I'll kick off for you, Andrew. Philip. I'm an interloper from Sandhurst. I've come to ask a question about old people, because I'm getting very close to it at the moment. So it's a subject close to my heart. There's been a lot of talk in the press and in Parliament recently about the aspects of dementia care for older people. The fact that it's claimed that only 50% of those people suffering from dementia actually have been diagnosed as suffering, and that we've got a massive explosion in the elderly population. And I think Bracknell even acknowledged now that because of the time when Bracknell Newtown was set up, there is a huge time bomb of elderly people waiting to explode in Bracknell. And we're going to experience a percentage of elderly people far greater than the national average. Now in Sandhurst we recently had an application for a 90-odd bed care home specialising in dementia, which was thrown out by Bracknell Council. It went to appeal and was still rejected. But there was detailed analysis as to the needs for extra care for old people. And interestingly enough, Bracknell Forest themselves have recently closed down their domiciliary care unit, which was caring for just 9 people and costing over £300,000 a year to run. But that was a good decision, because that's far too much money, and they've transferred those people to the independent sector. What I'd like to ask you is, do you think that the government centrally and local government is paying enough attention to the fact that the numbers of the elderly people that are going to need supporting in some way or other are going to grow so exponentially? Is there going to be enough provision for them?
Right, well that's a big question. They're aware of the fact that this challenge is coming down the line. In fact, ageing in all of its, all the issues that ageing brings is very much in the forefront of my mind, and I am somewhat concerned that as a nation we're not really ready for it. And the difficulty is that we have known this was coming. It isn't just Bracknell. The reason that places like new towns like Bracknell were built is because a lot of children have been born 45 through to 60. That's the baby boom generation. And you could predict that we were going to need more places to live. So there were a series of new towns chosen, of which Bracknell was one. So we've known that 65 years after that baby boom, there was going to be this generation who, through no fault of their own, other than the fact that they've aged human beings, were going to then become a disproportionately large, in comparison to previous generations, burden upon health and welfare. And it's not just in dementia, it's across the board. The problem is that we embark upon this period, because if you add 65 to 45, what do you get? You're 2010. So we're sort of at the starting point of this. We embark upon this period with £1.3 trillion worth of debt. We embark on this period as a nation with over 5 times the size of our economy in debts and liabilities, personal and state combined. So we've not done very well, have we, really, as a nation? I'm not going to get too party political about this, because actually the genesis of this stretches back over a number of decades. And we find ourselves at this point. Now, the current government came in and it had its financial situation to deal with, which you've all heard about. They did recognise this by pushing back the retirement age to 66 by 2020. They recognised that that was a belated move. It's already 67 in Germany, for example, the country that's paying everyone else's bills at the moment. They work till they're 67. But so we are a bit late to this, but specifically with dementia, which is predicted to almost double in the next 10 years. I am not convinced that anywhere is necessarily ready for this. I don't think Bracknell Forest is any different, really, in my experience of elsewhere. And as a GP, I've visited quite a few of these establishments over the years, and they're not always like they should be, as you well know. Some of them are of a lower standard, and I suspect with the CQC, who've now been tasked with not just checking out hospitals, but now checking out residential elderly accommodation. And so I fear we're going to be getting some difficult stories when the CQC start going in to some establishments. So it's not a rosy picture. Specifically with the private dementia home that was proposed down near Sandhurst. I must say, when somebody came to see me about it before the proposal was put in, and I thought, well, I suspect this will get accepted because a rational sort of assessment of expected need over the next 10, 20, 30 years, I think this will pass. And I must say, I was surprised that the assessment that was made on the planning authority side, and it wasn't actually the council, it was also backed up by, I think it's been pushed down further down the line.
Went to appeal,
yeah. And the assessment was somehow it wasn't needed. And I must say I was surprised at that, and that's not to comment specifically upon the planning application, it's upon the assessment of need. So in response to that, I've had discussions at Westminster with ministers, and I've pointed out that in the defence of the council have a concern about liability going forward. So if somebody goes into a private dementia home and then runs out of money, the council have to pick up the tab. So if you think about it, if we just built lots of private dementia homes in this area and then everyone ran out of money, the council's going to go bust in short order. So there are problems here. But what you don't want are the councils protecting their accounts understandably, then stopping the necessary provision being built. There's a tension here, which I've highlighted to the relevant Secretary of State and said, look, I think this is something we might need to think about in terms of changing the way in which funding of these situations is implemented. I.e., you don't want to discourage Bracknell Forest. Maybe the funding has to come from central or whatever. There must be some sort of solution here. But no, I think in conclusion, the nation has to wake up to the reality that we're not ready for this bulge of older people coming down the line. We're not. The NHS isn't ready. Welfare system isn't ready. Dementia homes, none of this, and it's because, and allow me to criticise political predecessors. Politics increasingly is about next week. In fact, trying to get people to think about next week is sometimes a challenge. And with things like ageing and energy, they come to talk about that with you vis-a-vis Ukraine. These policies, and implementing it, and strategies to make the country resilient and a good place to live and all those sort of things, they take decades. You need a longer term take on things, longer term view. And unfortunately, we don't do that very well. Scandinavians do it better, the Germans do it better. We seem to be sort of trapped in quite a sort of a short-termist type attitude in politics.
On a supplementary, do you think you doctors and your colleagues are allowing us to live longer than our longer lives than our bodies can cope with.
I mean, there is a philosophical. It's probably not the time to do it, but there is a debate to be had about what constitutes a good life, and around what I mean. I used to say to some patients, what do you want to die of? And they used to look at me and go, well, do you want to live for 84 years and then pop your clogs, or do you want to live for 86 and spend 2 years incontinent? And they'd look at me. I said, but these are the challenges that we now face because medicine has advanced so much that we are keeping people alive longer. Now, I remember visiting a residential home not very far away from here and having a lucid conversation with a 101-year-old woman about the political scene. And she seemed reasonably comfortable and was leading what seemed to me a good quality of life. So you can't put a number on this. But where you're right is that by being so successful in medicine, by having really healthier diets, though that's probably changing at the moment, in the past, in the last sort of probably 15 years ago, healthier diets, being aware of fitness and having a less physically demanding life than predecessors. We now are living longer, but with that has come a number of issues, not least of which dementia.
Thank you.
Is the care bill addressing this situation?
The care bill? I don't think it specifically is addressing the situation. I think that there are a number of different things. No, there isn't just one bill. There are a number of issues around how we deal with ageing, how we pay for it. I mean, most of our funding of government services is Ponzi scheme. So those of you who are retired in the room, your retirement hasn't been paid for by your taxes in your working lives. Your retirements are being paid for by the taxes of people currently working now. Now, in view of the fact that the number of people retired in relation to the number of people in work is increasing, and I repeat again, 1.3 trillion, this isn't going to work. Okay, so there are some real issues around the whole ageing agenda about what is sustainable. I think it's beginning to be now more acceptable to discuss these issues, though I would say that it isn't always particularly well received to start talking about pushing back retirement ages, suggesting that people may need to live in smaller accommodation, maybe that families need to take on more responsibility for their elderly because the state won't be able to do it. I go back to almost a more traditional family model of provision of care.
Philip, sorry, can I just interrupt up there? There is a difficulty in the family taking on more responsibility because if you've got parents who are, say, in their late 80s and 90s, it means that you yourself are in your 60s.
Yeah, I know.
And even though you're probably fitter than the previous generation were, there is still, you're feeling as though you should be, retiring and enjoying rather having to look at aged relatives, aged parents. There's a physical problem with people looking after a 90-year-old when you're yourself 60.
I'm not necessarily suggesting that you should actually do it yourself, though some people may choose to do that. I'm saying that the responsibility, so if there's a financial component because you have to employ someone to do it, the responsibility is increasingly going to move away from the state towards individual families. Now, there may be people who think that's fundamentally wrong and the state should be there to do it. I'm not one of those. The state is already around about 45-46% of GDP. It's not sustainable. And if you're a young person at the moment, under 40, successful, entrepreneurial, wanting to get on in life, it's difficult to dissuade them from emigrating to countries where the state's smaller, where the tax burden is less, where they have more money because they've saved it and we haven't spent it. It's extremely difficult balance to start saying that the state's going to step in because you're 68 and you can't help your 92-year-old mother. I understand the practicalities, I understand the reality, But I'm just looking at the numbers and the financial position we're currently in and the financial position that we're going to be in 10 years from now, when that baby boom generation really are, I mean, some of them will be in there sort of approaching 80, it doesn't bear thinking about. And the last thing I want is a society in which elderly people are not being properly cared for, in which elderly people feel insecure, in which elderly people are going hungry. I don't want that. But I look at the situation the state finds itself in, and when you're in government, you're constantly having to balance what your priorities are. You know, I was just saying to my researcher on the way in, we're currently spending £350 million a day on the National Health Service. I mean, try to get your head around that figure. £350 million a day. We're spending £700 million a day on welfare and pensions. It's £1 billion.
So what's the plan then?
Well, what I'm trying to say is the plan has to be that we're all going to have to accept, as families, I think, my own judgment is it says as families, that we need to start making allowance provision for our futures, perhaps more than the generation the current generation who've come through sort of post-war, who have always been told by politicians, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to excuse this, that you pay your taxes, it's going to be there for you when you get to the end. I think now increasingly I detect amongst 30 and 40-somethings healthy discussions, debates about, my God, what's going to be there for me? You know, how am I going to do this? And this is the same generation who struggle to buy homes at the moment. You know, it's the same generation who are thinking, hang on a minute, I've got to try and pay for tuition fees for my kids if they want to go to university. I've got to try and pay for a home. I've also got to try and, I mean, did you see this week that baby care, the kiddie care is now more per month than the average mortgage payment? And at the same time, they're also having to pay the taxes to keep people retired for 25 years. And at the moment, that group, and I'm not meaning to sound bitter, I'm in the middle of this, okay? We are being financially squeezed. And I'm begging in Westminster that the budget shouldn't be about triple locking pensions and everything else. We've got to try and give something to young people, because it's the young people, the people under 40, who have got the energy, the strength. They're going to go out there, they'll set up their business, going to work hard, they're going to make money for the nation, make money for themselves, for their families. These are the people that we want to incentivise, to support at the moment, so that everybody in this room can retire safe in the knowledge that their country has a future not just for themselves, but a sort of future also for their children and their grandchildren. And that's sort of where I am on this, and this is why I'm trying to pull my own political party into thinking, I know it makes sense to go after the grey vote, I understand all of that, and they're the ones who vote and the young people don't vote, and I understand all of that, but it's got us to where we are now. We're not in a good place as a nation. We are vulnerable to this ageing bulge that's coming through. We're also vulnerable to any energy spikes in prices, which is why we're not perhaps responding to Ukraine as we instinctively think we should be responding. There's a lot of things where this country doesn't have that independence and that resilience in place. And that's what I have got into politics to change. And no illusions about how difficult it is to change it. But we have to accept, we all have to accept, everybody from all backgrounds, that things are going to have to change, which might mean that foregoing a holiday because you're putting some money in an account for when you might get dementia in the future. I mean, I had a chap come to see me in Sandhurst who wants to buy a property with 5 other families because they wanted to get their own residential home. So 6 families are going to buy somewhere, the Joneses, the Smiths, the Robinsons, are each going to have a room. And it was going to be passed on families to families to families. I thought it was an amazing idea to have come forward with. Now, not everybody's in the financial position to do that, but I thought it was an interesting development that came from the people. It didn't come from political parties. And it was their reaction to what they were seeing all around them, which is a lot more grey hair. And they also, they've read the papers, they've seen the debts, they've read all the figures, and they've gone, my God, this isn't what's going wrong here, we've got to respond. And I liked it because it came from the people. It was about personal responsibility. Let's take responsibility for this situation, which is what I mean with regards to going forward, is I want a state that's there for the truly vulnerable, the people who can't help themselves, the mentally unwell, the very, very old and the very, very young. Okay, but I think at the moment the state looks after, by various means, more people than it can afford to. And I think we've got to try and find a way of inspiring people to take more responsibility for their lives at an earlier stage. And it's difficult politics because it doesn't necessarily attract votes.
So to say I'm going to put aside holiday money to pay for my dementia is ludicrous, because my father is 100, I'm 75.
Yeah.
My father's paid £3,000 a month for his care.
Yeah.
So holiday costs £2,000.
No,
so you put many
It was-
holidays away.
What I was trying to say, sir, is that I think our lifestyles are going to have to change and become impacted upon in order for us to make a provision for the future. Of course, one holiday is going to pay for 1 month, by the sounds of it. I understand that.
And his mother's in
Yeah,
town too.
okay, exactly. But I say to you again, how fair is it for the people in this country under 40 to be basically told you can't afford a home, the debts are going to be north of 2 trillion by the end of this decade, and the National Health Service is going to be creaking, and this is despite ring fencing of funding. I went to a meeting this afternoon. I spoke at the BMA House this afternoon, and I mean, these are all these experts. These weren't politicians, all in the room saying, too many hospitals, got to reduce the number of casualty departments, we've got to reconfigure, and all this sort of stuff. I mean, it's really, it's there, it's real, and